I never thought that I would start all over again at the age of 30, but here I am sitting in a tattoo parlor, watching as a thin needle, humming, pierces my skin, leaving an ink trail that will now become a part of me forever. 3 years ago, my life seemed flawless, like a carefully constructed mosaic in which every piece was in its place, and the central part of this pattern was Mike, the man who was not just my lover, but also my support, my best friend, the one who could dispel any worries with just a glance. He was incredible, in a way I never dreamed of seeing a man next to me. During the day, a talented doctor who devoted himself to saving lives. In the evening, a virtuoso guitarist who could make even the most hardened heart tremble from his playing, and at night, a gentle, caring, infinitely kind man with whom I wanted to grow old. We've been together for 5 years, and during that time I've gotten used to the fact that happiness is not something ephemeral, but a tangible reality that you can feel with every cell of your body when warm arms hug you in the morning, when laughter is heard at unfunny jokes, when the music of his guitar sounds in our little room, turning ordinary evenings into magical moments. I made fun of his passion for motorcycles, called him a weekend warrior, and laughed when he tore off his doctor's coat to put on worn leather jackets, but I actually liked how he combined two opposites, dedication to duty and a thirst for freedom. That morning, everything was as usual, a quickly brewed coffee, a lazy kiss goodbye, his smile when he grabbed his helmet and said he would take a short ride before starting his shift. And I never saw him again. The driver ran a red light, and in one moment my whole life was crossed out. I still don't remember the first weeks after the accident. Everything merged into an endless stream of days filled with other people's voices, sympathetic glances, paperwork and pain that settled in me and did not let me breathe. I worked non-stop, without sleep, taking all possible projects, just not to think, not to feel, not to exist. Sarah, my older sister, is the only one who was able to get me out of this state. She usually looked down on me, condemning my impractical decisions, but then she just came, brought her boys, Tommy and Jake, and stayed by my side, even when I couldn't say a word. The children were the only thing that reminded me of life at least a little, their laughter, their endless questions, their warm palms squeezing my hand. I've been on autopilot for 3 years. I didn't date, I didn't have fun, I didn't allow myself to dream. Only the code, the lines, the symbols, the black and white monitor screen, the loneliness that has become familiar. I earned enough to help Sarah. She raised the children alone after the divorce, and that was probably the only goal I saw for myself. And then they came, Mike's former bandmates, our old friends, with whom we sometimes gather to remember the past, laugh about the past years, listen to old recordings. That night, Dave, their vocalist, pulled out Mike's guitar, strummed the strings, and the sound, painfully familiar, pierced right through me. He smiled and said that music is a medicine for the soul. I do not know what happened then. Maybe it's just that too much has accumulated, and something inside me has cracked, broken, turned over, but I realized that I can't do this anymore. That I have to do something meaningful. For him. For myself. I've never liked tattoos. I've always considered them something alien, irreversible, but the idea that I could carry him with me, capture a part of his soul on my skin, seemed right to me. The tattoo parlor turned out to be completely different from what I imagined. In my imagination, it was a dark, gloomy place, with dubious personalities and the smell of cheap tobacco. But the reality turned out to be different, a stylish, almost artistic space, the smell of fresh ink and sterility, soft light reflected in glass cases. The artist Anna listened attentively to me, looked at Mike's photographs, asked about his gestures, facial expressions, and special features that I wanted to preserve. She drew the sketch for a long time, clarifying the details, listening to my stories, until the very image appeared on the paper, Mike with a guitar slung over his shoulder, with his eternal half-smile, the same one that appeared when he played. I couldn't take my eyes off my hand when she finished. It hurt like hell, but it was worth it. Every stroke, every line, every shadow, everything was perfect. It was like he was with me again. 2 weeks have passed, and the tattoo has healed perfectly, becoming an integral part of me, as if it had always been there, on my skin, woven into my story, as an invisible but tangible link with the past. I decided it was time to visit Sarah and the guys, especially since after our last conversation on the phone, she sent me a couple of short messages, none of which contained anything but dry, neutral phrases, as if she was trying to avoid any personal topic, and it was clear to me that the conversation about the tattoo was up to her. I still haven't let go. It was a warm, sunny Saturday afternoon when I drove up to Sarah's house, and when I got out of the car, I stood for a moment, enjoying the feeling of the soft autumn air on my face. I loved this house. It was always filled with noise, children's laughter, the smell of fresh biscuits or freshly brewed coffee, and even if Sarah often annoyed me with her moralizing tone, I loved being here. When I knocked, I immediately heard footsteps on the stairs, then the door slammed, and a second later the door of the house abruptly opened, releasing a disheveled, beaming Tommy onto the porch, who, despite his 12 years, still retained his childlike spontaneity and did not hide his delight when he saw me. "Tasha!" "Stop it!" he shouted, rushing at me with such force that I had to take a step back to stay on my feet. I laughed, hugging him back, while Jake slowly walked out of the house, maintaining an emphatically indifferent look, although I managed to notice how the corners of his lips twitched up in a barely restrained smile. "Hey," he muttered, shoving his hands in his pockets, but I knew he was glad to see me, even if he didn't want to admit it. "And here you are." Sarah's voice rang out, and I looked up to see her standing in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Perfect timing, I just made lunch. Come in." The house was warm and cozy, and smelled of something delicious, something homey, with hints of cinnamon and fresh pastries. Without thinking, I took off my jacket and hung it on the hanger, forgetting that now there was something on my arm that would definitely provoke a reaction. The silence was almost palpable. I didn't even realize what was going on until I noticed how Tommy suddenly froze, staring at my hand with wide eyes, and Jake slightly raised his eyebrows, looking away from the phone screen. And at that moment, Tommy exploded. "No! It's Uncle Mike!" he exclaimed, rushing to me and almost forcibly turning my arm over to examine the tattoo better. "It's so cool. Jake, look, he's got his guitar and everything." Jake, trying to maintain an appearance of indifference, slowly approached and bent over my hand, squinting as if assessing the artist's work. "Actually, it's very cool, Tasha," he said, and there was no usual sarcasm in his voice, just genuine admiration. "He looks just like him." It was at this moment that Sarah's icy voice sounded, slicing through the room like a sharpened blade. "Tasha, what were you thinking? It's just ugly." The boy's excitement instantly disappeared, and even Tommy, who was almost jumping with delight a second ago, frowned and lowered his eyes. "I can't believe you did something so permanent without even consulting anyone," Sarah continued, folding her arms over her chest and glaring at me. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, but I clenched my teeth and refrained from making a sharp reply. "Sarah, I didn't need to consult anyone. It's my body, and I decide what to do with it." "But you didn't even think." "About what?" I looked at her defiantly. "That you won't like it." Her face tightened, but she didn't say anything else, just turned around and walked back to the kitchen. We sat down to lunch, and although the boys still occasionally cast admiring glances at my hand, discussing their favorite memories of Mike, Sarah sat in silence, only occasionally pursing her lips and directing reproachful glances at me, as if the tattoo had personally offended her. I tried to turn the conversation around by telling Tommy and Jake about Mike's first failed attempt to teach me how to play the guitar, how he laughed when I managed to break a string for the third time, and how he finally said that I had a better chance of succeeding in programming than in music. The boys laughed, but Sarah continued to push the food around her plate in silence. It was about 8 when my phone rang, and when I saw my mom's name on the screen, I immediately realized what was waiting for me. Sarah must have texted her as soon as I took off my jacket. "Tasha," Her mother's voice was that special mix of disappointment and condemnation that she had been honing for years. Your sister just told me what you did to yourself. I have to say, I totally disapprove of this. What were you thinking about? I took a deep breath, rolling my eyes. Mom, I'm 30 years old. I don't need your approval when it comes to my own body. She made a small, annoyed sound, the one that always appeared when she was really unhappy, and then just hung up without even saying goodbye. The next few weeks passed in a fog of code and deadlines. I was working on a major project for a new client, which meant endless hours in front of the monitor, coffee, cold snacks, and total immersion in work, which, in fact, turned out to be almost a relief, because I had a good reason not to visit Sarah and deal with the latest family drama about my tattoo. But eventually the project came to a stable point, and I no longer had any excuses to avoid family commitments. I headed to Sarah's house on Saturday afternoon, trying to push away the uneasy feeling that had settled inside me from the very moment she dryly replied to my message without the usual sarcasm or passive aggression, but simply wrote briefly, "Okay, come over." I knew my sister too well not to notice that something was wrong, but I decided not to wind myself up in advance. As soon as the door opened, all doubts were dispelled. Her face was tense, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes shone with that special cold look that foreshadowed either a serious argument or a long lecture about how I disappointed the whole family, and this time, judging by her expression, the lecture option was unlikely. The familiar sound of a video game could be heard in the living room, and when I entered, Tommy and Jake immediately jumped up from the couch, smiling and preparing to run over to me, but Sarah abruptly raised her hand, and their enthusiasm instantly faded. "Boys, go upstairs," she said in a tone that left no room for objections. Tommy pursed his lips, and Jake frowned, but they both knew it was pointless to argue. They exchanged glances with the same concern with which children usually react to adult fights, and after giving me one last look, they trudged upstairs in silence. A few seconds later, I heard the sound of a door closing, and the house became so quiet that I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. "What's going on?" I asked, feeling an unpleasant lump tighten in my stomach. Sarah crossed her arms over her chest and stared at me, and it suddenly became clear to me that she was really serious. "Do you know what Tommy asked me yesterday?" She began, tilting her head slightly to the side, as if giving me a chance to guess for myself. I just shook my head. He wanted to know if he could get a tattoo when he turned 16. And then Jake intervened and said that he had already searched for tattoo artists on the internet. I blinked, wondering why I needed this information. "Sarah, they're just kids," I said carefully, hoping to steer the conversation in a rational direction. "They can't get tattoos without their parents' consent anyway, and by the time they can actually make those decisions, they'll figure out for themselves what's right for them and what's wrong." But my words didn't make any impression on her. On the contrary, they only angered her even more. "They never talked about tattoos until you showed up with that thing on your arm." Her voice cracked with annoyance, and her fingers curled into fists. "It's totally your fault." I took a deep breath, trying not to react to her tone. "Come on, Sarah," I tilted my head to the side, trying to speak calmly. "Tattoos are everywhere now. Half of the people in the grocery store have them. Boys probably see dozens of people with tattoos every day at school. You can't seriously blame me for being interested in this." But Sarah just shook her head, clenching her jaw, and when she spoke again, her voice rose an octave. "Don't you dare try to rationalize it." "Stop it," she almost shouted. "You have no idea what you started. Today it's tattoos, and tomorrow what? Will they start smoking because it looks cool? Then drink? And then drugs are not far away." I stared at her, stunned by the absurdity of that statement. "Sarah, are you serious?" I said, narrowing my eyes. "You've just literally equated getting a commemorative tattoo to ruining a life. You don't understand," she exclaimed, turning abruptly and walking across the room. "You've always been so reckless. And now you come to my house and set a bad example for my children." I didn't even know what to say. "Sarah, this is ridiculous," I finally said, feeling irritation begin to boil inside. I've never smoked a single cigarette in my life. I go to the gym several times a week. The wildest thing I drink is kombucha. You know all this. It doesn't matter." She blurted out, and I noticed how her face was flushed with tension. "The fact is that you've changed." She straightened her back, making that gesture that always foreshadowed that she was about to say something that, in her opinion, was the irrefutable truth. "I've been thinking about it a lot," she continued, folding her arms over her chest. "And I don't want you to come to my house anymore." There was a deathly silence in the room. "What?" I exhaled in disbelief. "You're a bad influence on my boys," she said. I blinked a few times, unable to process what I had just heard. Then suddenly I laughed briefly, because it seemed so ridiculous, so absurd, that my first reaction was just nervous laughter. "A bad influence?" I repeated, shaking my head. "Because of the tattoo?" "Sarah, can you even hear yourself right now?" "Don't mock me," she snapped. "I'm serious. I want you to leave. And I don't want you to come back." I nodded slowly, feeling something snap inside, as if the last thread that connected us had snapped. "This is crazy," I breathed, grabbing my bag and heading for the door. "You're making a big deal out of a molehill, and you know it." Sarah was silent, crossing her arms and turning away, as if she had already decided for herself that I did not deserve even one last look. I stood in the doorway, looking at her for the last time, and felt my heart tighten with resentment. "Call me when you come to," I said one last time, before walking out the door and slamming it behind me. I left her house that day, feeling as if I had been in some strange, surreal dream in which reality had suddenly been distorted beyond recognition, and a simple tattoo, a beautiful work of art created in memory of Mike, had somehow turned into a catalyst for a family disaster. I drove home on autopilot, automatically checking the route along familiar streets, but inside I was seething with indignation and resentment, because I couldn't understand how Sarah could so abruptly reject me because of something as insignificant as a drawing on my skin. She was always the more traditional of the two of us, but even for her, this reaction seemed excessive, ridiculous, absurd, and I kept telling myself that when the first anger subsided, she would realize how stupid it all was, and we would just go back to normal life, because it couldn't be otherwise. But time passed, and nothing changed. I continued to send her money for utilities, as I had done for years, because regardless of her ridiculous resentment, I couldn't let her and the boys experience difficulties because of the family drama. I knew that Sarah was proud and would never have accepted help directly, but these monthly transfers had long been a tacit agreement between us. She accepted them, and we didn't discuss it out loud. However, as the days turned into weeks, I began to worry about something much more painful than Sarah's stubborn silence. Tommy and Jake were gone. No messages, no calls, no stupid memes that they usually sent me every week, no video calls that used to be our tradition. The boys who used to call me regularly to share something important or just to chat suddenly disappeared, as if someone had erased me from their lives. I tried to text them first, as usual. "Hi, Tommy, how's your science project? Hey, Jake, have you passed that impossible level in the game yet?" But there was no response. It didn't take a genius to figure out that Sarah had most likely forbidden them to communicate with me, and the thought of her using her own children as weapons in this absurd conflict infuriated me. 2 months passed, and I did what I always did when I didn't know how to deal with emotions. I went into work with my head, took on additional projects, filling the days with code, lines, deadlines, endless calls and letters, but the closer Thanksgiving Day got, the more I was growing worried because, after all, it was our main family holiday, the day when we all got together, no matter what. Usually, Mom called a few weeks before the holiday to coordinate the menu and discuss plans, but this time there was complete silence. She probably just forgot, I muttered to myself, even though I knew it was a lie. Mom never forgot to invite me to Thanksgiving. But I decided not to dwell on anxious thoughts and do what I did every year. I bought thoughtful gifts for everyone, because if we were going to sit at the same table, at least let this day pass peacefully. I chose a game console for Tommy, which he had been dreaming of for the past few months, for Jake, a set of expensive art supplies necessary for his portfolio, and for Sarah, the very coffee maker that she had been eyeing for a long time, but could not justify buying for herself. On the eve of Thanksgiving, I loaded the trunk of the car with gifts and tried to be positive, telling myself that they couldn't let this ridiculous situation ruin the holiday. Even 3 years ago, when I was in a terrible state after Mike's death, I still gathered my strength and came to dinner, because this day was more than just a tradition, it was a symbol of the family, despite all our differences. When I arrived at my parents' house, everything looked as usual: bright autumn wreaths on the door, small pumpkins neatly placed on the porch, and the same old ceramic turkey that had been there since my childhood. I smiled, overcome by warm memories, but that smile faded instantly when I opened the door. The scene I entered was strange. Everyone was there: Mom, Dad, Sarah, Tommy, and Jake. But instead of the usual Thanksgiving chaos, noisy laughter, hasty packing at the table, arguments about recipes and children's hubbub, there was a tense silence in the room. They looked at me as if I were a ghost that had suddenly materialized in their house, something unexpected, unwanted. "Tasha," Mom's voice sounded harsh, with a hint of displeasure that I hadn't heard very often. "What are you doing here?" I froze on the threshold, clutching the gift bags in my hands, not understanding what was going on. "What do you mean?" I said slowly, looking at her in utter disbelief. "It's Thanksgiving." Mom looked at me as if I'd said something ridiculous. "We thought you weren't coming," she said, and there was no joy in her voice, just a kind of strained restraint. I looked at the others. Tommy and Jake looked at me with expressions of concern, but remained silent, as if hesitating to take a step towards me. Sarah sat with a stony face, clearly pleased that I was in the middle of this awkward moment. "Why?" I asked, looking directly at her, because I intuitively understood that she was the one behind it. "Because you've obviously decided that you don't need a family anymore," Sarah said coldly, folding her arms across her chest. I felt anger flare up inside me, but I took a deep breath, trying not to let it get the better of me. "I never said that," I replied calmly. "What about your choice?" Mom pursed her lips. "You didn't even think about how he would affect us." I blinked in disbelief. "Are you talking about my tattoo now?" I asked slowly. Mom looked away, and Sarah lifted her chin as if challenging me. I looked at their faces, realizing that this was no longer just an argument, but something more. Something broke between us, and I didn't know if I'd ever be able to fix it. I brought gifts to everyone because I always did, because no matter what, I wanted to believe that this holiday was still our common one, that after all these months of silence and mutual resentment, we would be able to forget about our differences for at least one evening. But as soon as Mom opened her mouth, the illusion crumbled to dust. "We didn't invite you," she said slowly, as if she were talking to a child who needed to patiently explain the obvious things. "We thought you'd understand that this means you shouldn't come." I clenched my fingers on the packages, suddenly feeling their weight, as if instead of neatly wrapped gifts, I was holding stones in my hands. "I understand," I managed, my throat constricted so that it became difficult to breathe. "I understand why I wasn't invited to Thanksgiving." Sarah stepped forward with her arms crossed over her chest, and only then did I notice that the boys weren't looking at me. Tommy stared at the floor, his shoulders hunched, and Jake sat with his lips pressed together, clearly avoiding my gaze. "Because you've decided that you need to show off your tattoo and fill my children's heads with even more inappropriate ideas about acceptable behavior," Sarah announced, and there was such confidence in her voice, as if she were saying something undeniable, as if I had really done something monstrous. I set the bags down on the table harder than I needed to, the sound of the impact echoing through the room. Are you kidding? I had to force myself not to raise my voice. Are we still talking about this? It's been months. It's just a tattoo. Just a tattoo. Sarah's voice rose an octave. It's a symbol of rebellion and disrespect. I ran my hands through my hair, trying not to let the disappointment overwhelm me completely. Do you even hear yourself? I looked at my parents, hoping that at least they would support me, but my mother stood with a frozen expression on her face, and my father shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding my gaze. Uncle Jim has a full sleeve of tattoos. Cousin Rachel just got herself a huge phoenix on her back last month, and no one said a word about it. Mom immediately intervened, folding her arms over her chest and frowning. That's different, Tasha. Something else? I laughed bitterly. With what? Because I did it? You should have consulted with us first, she continued, as if she hadn't heard my question. You know how we feel about these things. I felt a wave of rage sweep through my body. Should I consult with you? I could barely contain my voice. I'm 30 years old. Why should I consult with someone about what to do with my body? Because we're your family. Sarah screamed. Because we have values. Because actions have consequences. The only consequences here are the ones you create, I blurted out, and for the first time that evening, I felt really hurt. I felt tears stinging at the corners of my eyes, but I didn't let myself go limp. This tattoo means something to me. It's for Mike. It's my way of keeping him around, honoring his memory. That's when Sarah said it. The words that changed everything. Oh, don't start that again, she huffed, rolling her eyes. Are you still crying all over yourself because of him? To be honest, I never liked him. He was always showing off with his stupid guitar, acting like a rock star, riding that death trap motorcycle. She let out a short, sharp laugh, and at that moment I realized what she was going to say next, but it was already too late. You know what? I'm glad he was hit by that car. Maybe now you'll finally grow up and start acting like a normal person. The room spun, and the words hit my chest with such force that it felt like I'd just been physically wounded. I could barely breathe, but somehow I found the strength to speak. Apologize, I demanded, at first softly, almost in a whisper, but then my voice grew stronger, became hard, almost metallic. Apologize right now for what you just said about Mike. Sarah lifted her chin defiantly. I will not apologize for the truth. I looked at my parents, expecting them to say something, that they would besiege her, that they would be outraged, but instead my mother stood up, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands, and said in a flat, calm voice, Tasha, I think it's time for you to go. I stared at them, hoping I'd misheard them. But no. My father continued to avoid my gaze, my mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Sarah stood with a triumphant expression on her face. The boys sat in silence, too scared or too confused to intervene. I took a deep breath to contain my emotions, grabbed all the gift bags and, without saying another word, left the house, feeling something crumble inside me, as if I had lost not only my family, but also a part of myself. The road to the local homeless shelter passed in a fog, as if my consciousness had turned off, and only when I stopped in front of the door did a new wave of emotions overwhelm me. Everything is new, I said automatically to the volunteer who opened the door. Game console, art supplies, coffee maker. The woman looked at me with mild surprise, but nodded and took the bags, and I turned around and left without waiting for thanks. I didn't want to hear anything. Everything at home remained untouched. I sat for hours in the dark living room, clutching a mug of already cold tea, not taking a sip, but just staring at one point, immersed in an endless stream of thoughts, memories, and questions that seemed to have no answers. Scenes from the past replayed over and over again before my eyes. How I helped Sarah for months after the divorce, paying bills that she didn't even ask about. How we chose gifts for boys for Christmas together. How I took them to the store every year for new school uniforms. How I once took Jake to a math tutor because he was afraid to tell his mother that he had problems. And after each of these actions, I thought it was natural, because isn't that what a family is for? I remembered how we flew to Hawaii a year ago. How Tommy saw the ocean for the first time with shining eyes and screamed with delight while the waves washed over his legs. How Jake, usually restrained and quiet, did not part with the camera, capturing every moment, and Sarah, for the first time in a long time, seemed really relaxed. She even laughed and said that she felt free, that perhaps for the first time in recent years she was just enjoying the moment without thinking about problems. I had already booked a trip to Europe for us this Christmas, dreaming of surprising the boys, showing them London, Paris, Rome, but now, sitting in the dark, I realized that I no longer wanted this. I did not want to do something for people who so easily decided to cut me out of their lives. Who felt that one tattoo negated all my actions, all my care, all the love that I had invested in them over the years. But it wasn't just the trips, it wasn't just the gifts, it wasn't just the money. It was 1,000 times more painful to realize that I had poured my soul into this family, and they hadn't just turned their backs on me. They saw nothing in me but a mistake that they thought I had to fix. I was thinking about Mike. About what he would say if he saw all this. At first, he would probably have joked, saying something about karma, and then he would have become serious and reminded me that love is not a one-way street, that I do not have to give myself to those who do not appreciate it, that care must be mutual, otherwise it is not a family, but just a toxic attachment that destroys me from the inside out. With these thoughts in mind, I opened my laptop and for the first time in a long time felt strangely calm. The letter practically wrote itself. Sarah. I've had time to think about what happened today, and I've made some decisions that I want to make clear right away. I will no longer send monthly payments for your utilities, as you feel that I have such a negative impact on your family. I'm sure you won't want to rely on my money. The trip to Europe that I planned for Christmas is cancelled, at least for you and the boys. I'm going alone. I have been saving money for Tommy and Jake's college for the past 2 years, but given your concern about my influence on them, I will close these accounts and invest elsewhere. I hope you can explain to the boys why they won't get any Christmas surprises this year. You can safely tell them that it's because their aunt's tattoo makes her unsuitable for their lives. Tasha. I clicked send and immediately turned off the phone, without even waiting for a possible instant reaction. My hands were shaking, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was protecting myself. The next morning, I stared at my phone for a long time before turning it on. As soon as the screen lit up, notifications hit me like an avalanche. 37 missed calls. 63 unread messages. 22 voice messages. I took a deep breath, holding the phone in my hand, and forced myself to open the first message. Sarah, how dare you do this to my children? You have no right to punish them because you're mad at me. Call me back immediately. I closed the message and moved on to the next one. Mom, Tasha, this is completely selfish. We raised you better. You're letting some kind of tattoo destroy our family. My fingers suddenly felt cold. The next message was from my father, short but no less filled with guilt. Father, your sister needs this money. Think about the boys. I scrolled through message after message. They all demanded answers, explanations, apologies. But none of them even mentioned Sarah's words about Mike. No one said she went overboard. No one wrote to me, I'm sorry, Tasha, she shouldn't have said that. No one acknowledged how cool her words were. I was sitting in bed, holding the phone in my hand, and suddenly realized that this was probably the clearest confirmation that I had made the right choice. My phone vibrated again, and a new message appeared on the screen. Jake, Tasha, I'm sorry. I do not know how to fix this, but I am sorry. I stared at the screen, and for the first time in months, something warm spread in my chest. At least one person saw me as more than just a mistake. On Thanksgiving Day, around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, an aggressive, almost demanding knock on the door distracted me from work. I tried to immerse myself in coding, to hide in the monotony of lines, numbers, algorithms, hoping to forget about what had happened for at least a couple of hours, but a loud voice echoing down the corridor shattered my fragile concentration, scattering it like a gust of wind scattering autumn leaves. "Tasha, open the door right now," Sarah shouted, and even through the thick door, I could hear the tension in her voice, on the verge of breaking down. "We need to have a serious conversation." I didn't move, taking a deep breath and hoping that if I just ignored them, they would leave. "Darling, please, let's talk about this like adults," my mother's softer but no less insistent voice intervened. I squeezed my eyes shut, feeling irritation rising inside, anger rising in my chest, mixed with fatigue, with the realization that these conversations would never lead to what I really want. "I don't want to talk to any of you," I replied, trying to keep my voice level and calm, even though everything inside me was boiling. "Please leave me alone. You're being mean." Sarah's voice cracked with tears, but I wasn't moved. "You're vindictive. Instead of fixing everything, you want to punish us, punish Tommy and Jake." I didn't even answer, just put on my noise-canceling headphones and returned to my home office, leaving them with their drama in the hallway. Eventually, their voices faded away, and the long-awaited silence fell. The next 2 weeks were like a psychological war. Every day brought new attempts to break my resolve, new waves of manipulation, pressure, hurtful remarks, complaints, pleas, everything except real remorse. My phone turned into a battlefield where guilt and family obligations were being attacked. "Honey, family is all you have. You can't just throw us away because of something so stupid," Aunt Linda said affectionately when I once again didn't answer her call. "Come on, Tash, just apologize and do the right thing. Family should stick together," Cousin Mark wrote, as if it were some trivial argument about politics over dinner. "Your mother is beside herself. Is it really worth it to destroy a family?" Uncle Peter tried to shame me. I just pressed the end call button, deleted the messages without reading beyond the first lines, and each time I felt a strange relief, each time I was convinced that I was doing the right thing. None of them, not a single person, said that Sarah was wrong. No one admitted that her words about Mike were cruel. No one thought about what it was like for me when I was cut out of my family because of the pattern on my skin. The closer Christmas got, the more the situation escalated. The attempts to contact me became more and more desperate, more and more persistent, but I did not respond. I refused to play by their rules, refused to be comfortable again. But Sarah was always stubborn. She ambushed me outside my house on a cold December morning when I went out for coffee before work. "Tasha, please, we need to talk," she shouted, hurrying towards me along the sidewalk, through the light snow that was slowly falling from the gray sky, covering the streets with a thin, untouched layer. I rolled my eyes and took another step forward, but she continued. "I've been thinking about what I said about Mike. I shouldn't have said that. I'm sorry." I froze in place, adjusting the strap of my bag on my shoulder, wondering if those words really meant something, or if it was just another maneuver. The words I'd been wanting to hear for weeks and now sounded hollow, without weight, especially considering their tardiness. "Are you really sorry, Sarah? Or are you sorry that I'm not paying your bills anymore?" My voice was flat but icy. "I'm sorry that the trip to Europe is cancelled. I'm sorry that the money for the boys' college has run out." Her face flushed red, and she clenched her fists. "It's not fair," she blurted out. "The boys shouldn't have to suffer because of our differences." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, do you know what's really unfair?" I narrowed my eyes. You forbade me from seeing them because of the tattoo. You said you were glad their Uncle Mike was dead. But now that the money is suddenly gone, do you want to make amends?" She opened her mouth to reply, but I cut her off. "College money," I continued, looking her straight in the eye. "You're right, it was. It was for the sake of their future. But you thought I was a bad influence on them, didn't you? Then, in your opinion, my money should be bad now too. Aren't we afraid that my corrupted morality by tattoos will ruin their future?" Sarah's face turned purple at first, and then turned almost purple. She opened and closed her mouth, as if trying to find the words, but nothing came out. I turned and walked down the street, leaving her standing there in the falling snow, still choking on her own anger. "You have no right," Sarah gasped, her voice cracking, filled with a mixture of anger, despair, and something else, something that might have been fear. But I interrupted her before she could say anything else. "No, Sarah," I said firmly, looking her straight in the eye. "Those are your words. Your logic. If I'm such a terrible influence on boys that I can't even be around them, then my money will undoubtedly be just as corrupting. I'm just following your example. This is different." She flared up, her face mottled with anger again. "This is their education." I shook my head, not looking away. "No," I replied calmly. "This is a consequence of your choice. You can't have both. Either I'm a really bad influence, and then everything related to me is harmful, or I'm their aunt who loves them and wants to help. Choose one thing." Sarah pressed her lips together, as if trying to come up with a counterargument, but the words never came. I was no longer going to stand on this cold sidewalk and participate in this endless farce. I turned around, walked to the door of my house and, without looking back, entered the building. Jerry, the elderly concierge who had been keeping order in our house for over a decade, was sitting at the reception desk. He raised his head and smiled pleasantly, but when he saw my face, he immediately became serious. "Jerry," I said, leaning on the counter, "my sister and parents are no longer welcome. Please don't let them on my floor." He raised his eyebrows, but didn't ask anything, just nodded and carefully made a note in the visitor's log. "Of course, Miss Tasha. Christmas has arrived. For the first time in my life, I spent it alone. Well, not quite alone. I spent it in Paris, then in Rome, then in Barcelona, allowing myself to just go with the flow, breathe the sea air, wander through the narrow streets, look at the world without having to explain to someone what I was doing and why. I didn't post photos on social media, and I didn't tell anyone from my family about my trip, but through family rumors, I still heard Sarah and my parents complain to anyone who would listen about their selfish daughter who abandoned them because of one tattoo. But standing on the bridge in Venice, watching the sunset turn the canals golden and pink, I suddenly realized one important thing. It was never about the tattoo. Maybe she never existed at all. It was about control. In a family dynamic that was toxic long before I got Mike's image on my arm. The need to conform, to be comfortable, to conform to their ideas of who I should be. But I no longer wanted to be the one who made concessions just to preserve the fragile peace. The day I returned from Europe, I did what I should have done 3 years ago. I made an appointment with a therapist. Dr. Martinez's office turned out to be warm and welcoming, not at all like the sterile white walls I had imagined. There were upholstered chairs, shelves with books, paintings with abstract landscapes, and the smell of fresh coffee. "Tell me, why are you here?" "What is it?" she asked, her voice soft but professional. I absent-mindedly touched my tattoo, ran my fingers along the guitar line outlined in black ink. "I need to work on some things," I admitted, choosing my words. "Mostly family ones. And I need to figure out how to let go of someone I've lost while keeping the memory of him alive." Dr. Martinez nodded without interrupting, giving me the opportunity to continue when I was ready. "I loved Mike. I still love him," I guess I took a deep breath. But I know he wouldn't want me to be stuck in the past. He always said that life should be lived courageously. And for the first time since his death, I feel like I'm really doing it. I smiled as I looked at my hand, at the image of Mike with a guitar, which somehow became the catalyst for this whole transformation. I realized one more important thing. It's not just a monument to Mike anymore. It became a symbol of my strength. My ability to stand up for myself. My willingness to live on my own terms. It seemed to me that he was smiling at me from a tattoo, his guitar forever slung over his shoulder, forever captured in a moment of joy when he did what he loved. He will always live in my heart. But maybe now it's time to see what other joy life has in store for me.